Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! In the already pretty depressing world of Central Asia-focused journalism, we have recently reached a new low. On March 14th, President Donald Trump signed an executive order dismantling the US Agency for Global Media. According to the document, the agency should reduce the performance of their statutory functions and associated personnel to the minimum presence and function required by law. This effectively means that US-funded global media, including the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, are at risk of disappearing. In a Trumpian language, the agency's website now lists its alleged violations, which include massive national security violations, including spies and terrorist sympathizers infiltrating the agency, obscene overspending, hundreds of millions being spent on fake news companies, and a product that often parrots the talking points of America's adversaries. Of course, no further details are being provided, but in the world of Trump supporters, facts are not that important. In response, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, has sued the US Agency for Global Media and Trump's representatives leading the agency to block the decision to terminate their grant. This, they claim, would violate the Constitution and federal laws. It remains to be seen how this ends. But today I would like to briefly talk about the role Radio Free Europe has played in providing information to people in Central Asia and across the world. And then I will be joined by Dilmira Matyakubova, my good friend and a researcher from the University of Ulster who focuses on reputation laundering, to talk about how exactly kleptocratic regimes seek to improve their international image. Suffice to say, without Radio Free Europe, their job will be much easier. So, Radio Free Europe was funded during the Cold War, in a belief that in the end, the real confrontation will be taking place on the political rather than military front. In 1949, Radio Free Europe began broadcasting in Soviet satellite states, like Poland, while Radio Liberty opened 2 years later and focused on the Soviet Union. Until 1972, they were funded covertly by the CIA. Radio Free Europe has broadcast in local languages and employed foreign-based journalists who were able to gather information behind the Iron Curtain and bring verified news to people. For millions of people, Radio Free Europe was the only reliable source of information. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty continued its work and is currently working in 27 languages across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Middle East. In Central Asia, Radio Liberty and its local language services, Radio Ozodlik, Azatik, and Ozodi, have been instrumental in providing reliable information to millions of people who often had limited access to news in their own languages in authoritarian conditions. Only several months ago, the Uzbek service Radio Ozodlik published several investigations about the assassination attempt on Kamila Lamjanov, which I discussed last week. This shows just how important Radio Liberty's investigations have been. Ozodlik is still banned in Uzbekistan, and there were attempts to block Azatik in Kyrgyzstan too. And not for spreading fake news, as the Trump administration alleges, but for the exact opposite. The closure of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, would completely change the news landscape in Central Asia and devoid millions of access to verified information and excellent investigations in their own languages. I complained in the first episode of Turan Tales about the quality of journalism in the region. Well, that was before we learned about Trump's executive order. Now the situation is absolutely dire. I hope that my colleagues from Radio Free Europe, who have been doing an excellent job, will survive this and continue working with new funding. Otherwise, we are doomed. Now, I would like to invite you to a fascinating conversation about reputation laundering, a concept we should all learn and start using because we are likely to see more of it in the coming years, I'm afraid. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hello, my guest today is Dilmira Matyakubova, a political scientist and writer from Uzbekistan, who has a PhD in criminology from University of Ulster in United Kingdom, and is the author of Kleptocracy series on Substack, where she covers reputation laundering and authoritarian propaganda. Hi, Mira.
Hello.
My listeners have just listened to a story about Radio Free Europe, and it's a sad example, but unfortunately not an isolated one, of an outlet that is covering Central Asia and is unfortunately losing funding. I would like to ask you maybe firstly a personal question as somebody who lived in Uzbekistan most of her life. When you think back, what role has Radio Free Europe played in your life as someone who grew up in Uzbekistan with limited access to information?
I mean, it's devastating to hear about this reckless decision on defunding the Radio Free Europe and the Central Asian services. And, as a political scientist, I always struggle to find outlets that offered critical content. While living in Uzbekistan, you can only imagine how difficult that is. Radio Ozodlik was blocked under Karimov for decades, and now it is blocked still. At least last time when I checked, it was still blocked. You can only access it through VPN. So in a way, we lived in Uzbekistan in a sort of information vacuum. This was only possible, to break this vacuum if you traveled outside. So, for instance, I did my master's in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, which was much more open in comparison to Uzbekistan. And at the time, at least, you could access those blocked sites. You could access Fergana news, you could access Radio Ozodlik. So, I struggled as well. I struggled really to access those critical websites, the media. And Ozodlik plays a huge role in this, the Uzbek service of Radio Free Europe, because it offers basically critical content, good analysis and the coverage of the news and events in the region in local languages. And that is a very unique thing to do because, of course, yes, you can find now these days there is open source investigations, there are many options to read the news, but what Ozodlik and the Central Asian services of Radio Free Europe do, that they do offer in local languages. And that is very rare to find that level of reporting in a local language. So, for example, the narrative of Andijan 2005 in Uzbekistan.
Let's remind what happened in Andijan in 2005.
On 13th May in 2005, in Andijan, Uzbek city, and there was massacre and the mass shooting of civilian protesters in the square. And that event, which became known as Andijan events or Andijan massacre, didn't get much coverage. So, it did get some coverage, international coverage was there, some investigation was there, but it was never allowed by the Karimov government to do an independent investigation. So people outside Andijan didn't know much about what really happened there. They saw what was on TV, which was framed as armed insurgency, basically. Islamist armed insurgency planned by foreign forces. And they believed in it. Perhaps some still do. These narratives and the framing of events is very important. And when it is framed officially by the authoritarian government and it is broadcast, and that is what people believe in, they form their opinions based on what is available. Losing Ozodlik would be big loss. Basically, it would be devastating because it would be returning back to official propaganda, this brainwashing and whitewashing of events, at least in the case of Uzbekistan. In relative terms, more freer Kyrgyzstan, used to be freer at least. It is also, a government trying to crack down on free media, and it attempted to block Azadtik Media, which is the Kyrgyz service of Radio Free Europe, in 2022. So these trends are already happening inside the region.
I think another thing that Ozodlik especially did uniquely or has done uniquely is the investigations, because most media, even reporting in local languages or even reporting in English, they mostly focus on the news, on just providing information of what's going on. Whereas Ozodlik had really unique contacts within even the administration and among people who are somehow related related to the power structure. And as such, it always provided completely unique analysis and completely unique perspectives. So what can happen? What do you think is going to happen now? I mean, obviously, this is a little bit unclear for all of us. But do you think that it can get replaced somehow by something else?
Again, my fear is that the propaganda or this, official media and also controlled media, state-controlled media, is going to take over. And I have a working theory that Central Asian governments, at least Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, they are lobbying for the crackdown of Radio Free Europe. This is my own theory, based on my, observations and the analysis on foreign lobbying, that because they see this outlet as a threat to their regime stability, they're lobbying Washington to remove it. And that's the biggest fear the Central Asian governments have, that they don't wish people to know all these intricate details of their corrupt deals or rights violations involving state violence. In that sense, Azad League, these have been the strongest source of check on power, which is essential in an autocratic kleptocracy where checks and balances system is nearly non-existent. So that's my theory, that they have been lobbying Washington to remove it. And now that this has been very convenient for them, because Trump administration came and they don't really care. It's enabling it, making it possible that, okay, let's get rid of it. Let's not spend taxpayers' money on it, because they don't support these values: free media, free press.
Until recently, the United States has been seen as this kind of power that was pushing for democratic reform and anti-corruption reforms in Central Asian countries. Now it's basically gone. So it's probably going to empower Central Asian autocrats to basically continue their corrupt practices. You have been researching the topic of reputation laundering, which is a completely fascinating concept. And this is what also your PhD thesis was about. Can you explain what exactly it is and how countries employ it?
Yeah, sure. I have been researching authoritarian rebranding and reputation laundering for the last 8 years now. So I've written my doctoral thesis on this topic. So reputation laundering, essentially, it's a process of concealing and disguising the corrupt actions of politically exposed persons, governments, corporate entities. It could be individuals as well, the kleptocrats. And this form of reputation laundering on an individual level has been studied more than the one that is on a state level, which I focus on in my thesis. It explores the ways in which the governments, the states, use reputation laundering to diminish this stigma of corruption and shape international perceptions in a positive way. And they do that very systematically in a concentrated manner. I mean, I'm talking about the specific cases here. So just to be clear, I used the case study of Uzbekistan because it is aligned with the kleptocratic and autocratic regimes, that the nature of the regimes and how they attempt to oppose negative stories. And also because I've been collecting data in Uzbekistan on the related topic. That's why I chose Uzbekistan, although I do look at other countries like Azerbaijan as well. So just to bring an example of what reputation laundering would look like, I think the earliest examples one of the earliest examples would be the recruitment of Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain, to whitewash Kazakhstan's authoritarian leader, Nursultan Nazarbayev, the former president, on how to spin the 2011 Zhanaozen massacre. So this has been reported by investigative journalists, and there was a report in 2016 on the Daily Mail that Tony Blair used his firm to launder the reputation of Nazarbayev in an exchange for £5.3 million per year. So that's one of the examples, but there are many other examples.
But do we know exactly what Tony Blair did for this money?
So, yes, there are texts of the speeches and the policy memos, the sort of things that presidents have to present publicly. And he did write them. So he wrote the speech concerning the Zhanaozen massacre. There is an exact quote. I don't have it at my hand right now, but the idea is to frame the event in a way that would diminish the role of the state and its violence, basically. publicly, and to portray the leader as someone who is concerned about the stability and the peace in the country. And it's very similar to actually the Andijan event, the one I mentioned earlier, and how it was framed by the foreign sympathizers and lobbyists, basically. In the same way, these academic lobbyists, the so-called area specialists from Europe and America. I study in depth these group of academics who have lobbied for the Karimov regime at the time. And also they continue to lobby for the Mirziyoyev regime today. And they are the academics who run think tanks, including Frederick Starr and his entourage, Svante Kornal, and many others in the US. And they are based in Washington, D.C. So the Starr and his entourage, the so-called experts masquerading as scholars, tirelessly have apologized for Karimov regime violence and repression. And they have framed all these events, and now they are doing the same with the Nukus event, the violence. In 2022, in early July, so the 1st, 2nd July, there was a violent outburst in Nukus because of the protest. Again, similar situation. I saw the parallels right there. And these, lobbyists were doing the same thing. It's taking this event and then framing it in a way it's ridiculous, to read these statements. They put it in a way that, okay, this was just armed protesters. And that is the usual sort of framing. And also they try to label them as drug dealers and alcoholics, unemployed, just some citizens, unwanted citizens, right?
We've seen this actually, most vividly in Europe with the example of the so-called Putin verstehers, right? So people who are doing exactly the same thing in relation to Russia. They are whitewashing Russian crimes or always trying to understand the reasons behind Putin's actions or Russia's actions in general. When it comes to Putin, Russia is investing loads of money in its propaganda, right? Or in its soft power. So, of course, Russia has much more leverage to push forward its narrative than Central Asian countries who are not as well known and who are not as often engaged with by the West. So, from your experience, those actors who are involved in reputation laundering that you call enablers, be it international organizations or individuals and academics, are they useful idiots? Do they believe in what they say? Or they just simply are paid and benefit from it somehow?
Yes, there's all of them. In my, research, I include all of them. I study all of them. There are different actors. And by category, if I looked at the state institutions and politicians, and I looked at the corporate actors who are working in collaboration with the state, and I looked at the academics that I mentioned, and also I looked at these private actors. So, yeah.
So let's start maybe from those actors, academics, politicians. Are they mainly paid or are they just useful idiots?
The academics I mentioned, yes, they do get paid. And for instance, Kazakhstan had paid this same group, the network of CATSI, the Central Asian and Caucasus Institute, Red Stars Institute. They get paid through organizations like, the lobby organizations, DCI Group, and there are a few of them. They don't get paid directly, and that is something that this U.S. government is now, well, not now, but previously we've been trying to, just communicate this through our researchers and policy experts that this has to be explicitly said in their contract, that they need to state their nature of business. But because usually they don't state it just openly, it is usually said, this very broad language is used. The terms like bilateral relations, media relations, policy change, and so on and so on. These are not very specific terms that will describe their work. So, of course, they won't be stating that I'm lobbying for authoritarian government. And that will be self-defeating. And that is the problem that there is FARA, which means Foreign Agents Registration Act, which basically forces the foreign principals and foreign registrants to state their nature of relations and nature of work, what they're doing, what kind of service they're offering. And in those statements, they do use these terms like very broad, bilateral relations, media relations, which is not specific again. And there has to be a policy change in that to force them to specify what kind of services are they providing. And that's the kind of loophole these academics are using in order to apologize for these repressive regimes without the accountability that they have to inform, or they have to state anymore, or they have to declare about their income, money they are earning. Because it's the lobby organizations, they are receiving the money and not the academics themselves directly, which would, again, make them immune from prosecution or any kind of doubt.
So if I understand it correctly, the government is giving money to a lobby organization, and this lobby organization is giving the money to academics or academic institutions in a form of grants, or?
It's not necessarily grants, but the services they do. Like they might do number of roundtable discussions, for instance, where they use all these promotional, propagandistic materials. And they might do X number of publications, the academic reports, they call it, and they are paid reports. So there are a list of services they do provide, but again, they don't take responsibility for these as a lobbying job, which in fact it is, but they don't. But this has to be really looked at, and then in order to discern what it is really, I had to all go through back and forth to read all these reports and compare with their performance and read, just go through all these events that they perform. They are doing it in a very sort of subtle way that someone who don't know about these actors would think that they are benign actors, or very benign regional experts who are trying to do some analysis, they would think. And I know people who do think that way. I know academics or scholars who cite their work or who use as a reference these works, which essentially are propaganda materials. They shouldn't be citing them. They shouldn't be referring to them as like a legitimate piece of informational material. Again, is this just one group of actors I'm talking about? There are many.
Recently, Routledge actually has published a book called New Uzbekistan, The Third Renaissance. I'm not sure if you've ever come across this publication.
No, I haven't, but I know similar publications.
So this book looks completely legitimate. It was published by a big and prestigious academic publication. But if you look at the contents, you can see that even some of the language it employs is a language taken from Mirziyoyev's propaganda, basically. even using the word the Third Renaissance is a little bit tricky, because there is no such a thing as Third Renaissance. It can be taken in inverted commas, but definitely not used at face value. So I can understand how this mechanism works, but how about organizations such as the United Nations or the World Bank? In what way these organizations are the enablers of reputation laundering?
Yeah, that's a good question. To your first point on the book, although I haven't checked out this one yet, the new book you mentioned, Third Renaissance, which sounds ridiculous. But I know of a similar book, which is called Uzbekistan's New Face, which was published by the same group of actors, the academics I mentioned earlier. So this is typically the target of the regime, that they want their propaganda material published by established publishers, established outlets that would seem very legitimate in a way that, this author and this publisher, if they are respectable, they must publish very legitimate things. And that is the thinking behind targeting these outlets. And I know, specific academic articles, reforms. There's something related to reforms. I can't remember the exact titles now, but I do know the style. But exactly right, what you said, it's a propaganda material from Mirziyoyev's book, basically Mirziyoyev's mind. And that is exactly what they want. They can be cited, they can be referenced in a way that becomes the normal, legitimate sort of source of information. So it's not propaganda because it's published by Routledge, because Routledge. And I'm just actually really shocked and amazed. I'm not shocked because I expect these things, but in a way, to expect it from Routledge, that's kind of mind-blowing. The reform program set by the President Mirziyoyev that claims to be transforming the economy, the Uzbek economy, into neoliberal, market-based, free enterprise-based system, and involves many actors, such as international financial institutions, including Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, EBRD, which is European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So these actors, including the UN, United Nations, and the ILO, International Labour Organization, they have been supporting this idea of reform. And they have been enabling the sector-specific reforms in areas such as, the cotton, reforming the cotton sector, and few other sectors. So what is the role of these actors, as I call them, enablers? They are enabling the discourse of the Uzbek state in ways that would support the official messaging in those, grandiose events, economic forums, large-scale events, conferences, investor conferences, that they are supporting. Basically, they are speaking in the same language, saying, the state should be an enabler, they should not meddle, they should stay outside the private sector, and so on and so on. All the same messaging. So some actors within these good institutions their role has been instrumentalized in ways that they may not realize themselves. So they may be enabling this rebranding of the regime without knowing it. So unwittingly. And some unknowingly, some do know, and some do act as advisors. For instance, the former president of the EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, acts as an advisor to the Uzbek president on economic development and governance, and good governance, basically. And he also, as an advisor to Kazakh president, what he does is that he goes on and gives these interviews on media, and basically sympathetic media and the media that's run by state corporate actors. They talk about reforms and opening up and the investments and praising the president that, he's an amazing president, he's a reforming president. Yeah, without completely acknowledging the other side of the story. What is actually going on? What is, in terms of human rights violations, freedom of speech, crack down on protesters. Of course, this is not their topic. This is not I'm not suggesting that they should be talking about. The point is that they do promote these messages very strongly on the platforms that are very essential in framing the international perceptions. And that international perception, the positive image, is very much important for the Uzbek government because it even has an actual policy dedicated to image. It's called Strengthening the International Positive Image of Uzbekistan in International Arena. That is that is something. This was published in 2019, and it's unclear whether or not further it was approved. But I do know that it has been incorporated into national development strategies since 2017 up to 2026. So I read these documents, the policy documents, very closely, that I do notice the language and the statement and the framing of the action plans. So that's why I'm telling that this is a systematic and this is a concentrated effort by the state to whitewash its image. It's not only doing it just casually, like the individual kleptocrats might do when they see some negative article for instance, on the media, they aim to remove it, right? We have the case of the publisher HarperCollins, which was challenged by the Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich for publishing details, basically, about his corrupt activities. I think the author was Catherine Belton. So Putin's People, basically their book, I've read as well. And one of the tactics that kleptocrats use to counteract and dismantle the critiques that they try to attack the publishers, they try to attack the sources of criticism, and they try to remove a piece of information. And the states use this technique as well. So I look at my focus in my research is to look at it from the state's perspective. What do they do? So what does the state do? The kleptocratic state does in order to counteract the negative criticism. And there are many ways, we can talk about.
So how exactly, for example, the Uzbek government has used, the United Nations, the UNDP, or any other organizations in pushing its agenda and its narrative of reform?
The United Nations and its, some of its agencies have been also instrumental in promoting and enabling the positive image of Uzbekistan. For example, ILO, International Labour Organization, was promoting this idea of reform on cotton sector, that the use of forced labour by the state has been eliminated and is being criminalized. And the funny thing about it is that the chief technical advisor of the ILO has been personally proactive about disseminating this news and this positive narrative. And he's given interviews to the international media. He's posted incessantly on Twitter, the X, on social media, on Facebook, everywhere. And he has been also working in collaboration with other state corporate actors who run these investor companies, basically the consultancy firms that advise, investors, the government. Sometimes actually they do this propaganda work, and I followed them as well. There is one in Brussels. It's called Euro-Uz in short, which is actually called Europe-Uzbekistan Association for Economic Cooperation. And that is the organization that has been promoting these reforms, including the ones in the cotton sector. And the General Secretary of the Euro-Uz has written article how cotton boycott needs to end. So it's essentially lobbying for the lifting of the cotton boycott. And this has been also done by another PR firm, Eurasian Investor, basically. And they were writing together this piece, the argument piece for foreign policy, calling for removing it just to open up the industry. But what is interesting about this, that these state corporate actors, they have a stake in the industry. They're not just lobbying for lifting of the cotton boycott because they care about not using child labor or forced labor in cotton fields, but because they have business in textile and fashion industry in Europe and in Uzbekistan as well. Basically, my point is these self-interested state corporate actors who are working either in the government or in a corporation which works closely with the government, acquiring lucrative contracts, whether it's consultancy contract or a bid for supporting a textile enterprise. So these are very much self-interested actors, close ties to power, who are doing this lobbying. So that's my point. And this includes ambassadors as well. Ambassadors, Uzbek ambassadors abroad. So the state actors and the corporate actors all working together. So they're not, in a way, acting and enabling this in isolation. They're collaborating with each other.
Mm-hmm. If you could think about the most outrageous example of reputation laundering, what would that be?
Yeah, I can think of several examples, but the most outrageous or perhaps most brutal one would be the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the prominent critic of Saudi Arabia regime, and hosting these very luxurious and grandiose festivals in Saudi Arabia, inviting celebrities and sportsmen, big names, just to show that this is a very open country, human rights compliant, democratic, in that sense, just to send a message to the world. And this is happening already in other countries as well. Uzbekistan does that as well. Azerbaijan does that as well. Azerbaijan did that, in fact, last year by hosting COP29 and giving, Ilham Aliyev, the president of Azerbaijan, and just boasted and said that, critics failed to boycott us from hosting this event, and so we sort of succeeded. And this is a sign of recognition and respect of the international community of Azerbaijan. So this is what he said, because whilst, again, with all the human rights violations record in the country. So this is a tool for regimes to show themselves that, by hosting these events, they're kind of a very global, open, business-friendly partners in the international arena. So they hope that this is going to wash away whatever they do in terms of quashing dissent, killing their critics. And those are the, again, extreme examples. And there are many I can think of.
Well, I mean, in my work as a journalist, I also have received emails from PR companies that were looking for someone to cover a particular story related to Uzbekistan. And those companies were usually promising exclusive access to Uzbek officials in exchange for a positive story. Obviously, the fact that it should be a positive story was not always spelled out, obviously. But the topics that they suggested to journalists were positive. They were related to development or growth. And of course, I mean, in such situations, I say no, because I know that, this is essentially a PR company aiming at reputation laundering, basically what you are writing about. But probably there are many journalists who say yes to this kind of offers, especially that these offers include some sort of exclusive access. Do we know anything about those PR companies which are involved in this kind of emails, in reaching out to journalists? How much do they get paid for their work, and what kind of organizations these are?
Of course, yeah, and that's very funny, to hear the story you have encountered, and they do reach out to journalists who are freelancing or either doing some work in the region, or some of them are could be sort of not unrelated. They're not working in the region. They just targeted because they see that let's try out, why not, just at least might agree to write something positive. And I have a specific example for it, because there was the journalist who I spoke to, and he was recruited by a PR company in Samarkand in Uzbekistan, which is called Belgrave Strategic Communications. It's a UK company who's involved in promoting the new resort complex, all these fairy tale Samarkand Silk Road resort complex. It's called Silk Road Samarkand. And it is actually owned and sponsored by the rising oligarch Bakhtiar Fazilov, basically the energy tycoon, you could call. And Fazilov is implicated in major corruption cases in the energy sector in Uzbekistan. And Ozatlik and others have had, I think, reports on this. And so coming back to the journalist, he received an email. He was asked to write a puff piece on Samarkand, on this resort complex, Silk Road Samarkand. And he thought it would be a cool idea, just to go there with his wife and to just have fun, and then write something good about it. And then they do get paid. I don't know exactly how much, but I do know that they do get paid for the trip, and they do get paid for the piece. And this is kind of a normal sort of it's become a normal tradition in a way to recruit freelance journalists to cover Uzbekistan positively, super positive. And why super positive? Because the title of this piece is very interesting. It says, "Despite invasion, destruction, and abandonment, Samarkand remains beautiful." That is the sort of, these are the kind of the pieces that you're looking at basically when they are paid and promoted by the PR companies that are working with the oligarchs. And this was published in Irish News and later in the Independent So UK, Irish media, basically they are targeting international media to push these stories, positive stories, through hiring these journalists. So PR firms can do it. And also it's not only PR firms that are recruiting. There are brand ambassadors, Uzbekistan, appointed. And we know I know a very vivid case of a tourism ambassador of Uzbekistan, which is also from the UK. The UK has a big role in reputation laundering, just to emphasize that. And so the tourism ambassador of Uzbekistan to the UK, Sophie Ibitson, and she also promotes proactively Uzbekistan on social media. And she gives talks and lectures and all that, interviews on Uzbekistan and how people should be visiting Uzbekistan. And she's written books on tourism as well, like guidebooks. So of course, yes, they do that. These are PR firms and these are PR experts. For them, it's just like a matter of fact. It's just direct, like it's their business. That's what they're doing. They are marketing. They are selling the country. They don't think about national branding as something that is something ethical. Should be something ethical. But this raises ethical questions as well.
I think that, there are two things that we have to say here, that we are not against tourism and we are not against, people traveling to Uzbekistan for tourism, because this is obviously a very interesting country and a beautiful country that is definitely worth visiting. And there is also nothing wrong with, writing articles about tourism or even positive articles about the changes, because we know that in the past couple of years, there have been positive changes. And this is something that has to be said. I think the problem is, so that our listeners understand what we are talking about, is that those actors we are mentioning, or those actors that we are talking about here, they focus only on the positive. They fail to notice that Uzbekistan still has big issues when it comes to corruption, issues when it comes to human rights, and are actively whitewashing the problems or the mistakes or the corruption that Uzbekistan and other countries are involved in. So again, we are not pointing at organizations and people who are simply talking or focusing on tourism or like, let's say, light topics, but it's about individuals who do it deliberately and who allow such important topics as human rights and corruption be completely sidelined from the narrative.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that I need to clarify that as well. I do that in my thesis as well. So I'm not saying that this is bad or you shouldn't be doing this, because it's their business. They are doing marketing. Yes, they get paid for it. That's a matter of fact for them. That is business. And that they do state it as such as well. Like, you're doing marketing, it's just like selling Coca-Cola. It's like, a product. They look at countries as a product. And that is one way, like that is the dangerous zone in a way to frame and to package a country like that. And I would say that's why I mentioned ethics here, because there is, business ethics. And when you're doing business, you should be careful about what you're selling. And if you're selling X, Y, and Z, again, you should adhere to standards that normal corporations who are even selling Coca-Cola or whatever it is, Tesla, should be adhering. And that is the question here. Again, these actors are not all of them are acting consciously or knowingly. Some of them are simply doing their business and going about their day. For instance, technocrats in those institutions, development institutions. They might be just doing it because that's their normal business. They are thinking that they are transforming this country into a free market economy, which would open up jobs, which would open up whatever, this a whole new lifestyle, and that they believe in it. So they think they're doing the good thing. They're the good guys. They might be even heroes. They might, sort of fantasize themselves as Marx and Lenin or whatever. It's just revolutionaries. This is not exactly, my point is not to say that they are consciously doing it. Well, yes, of course, there are the ones who are doing it consciously, and they are self-interested, and they have stakes in the business, stakes in the industries that are involved. But again, there are those who are not necessarily aware of the enormity of their role and how it is enabling reputation laundering of a criminal state.
I have an example about that, actually. It was really interesting, but some time ago, I stumbled across an article by a woman, a native English speaker, whose name I just didn't recognize because, it is just not a name that I knew. The article was about the Third Renaissance. So the Uzbek idea of a huge change under Shavkat Mirziyoyev, of investment in education and science. Basically, it's something that Uzbekistan maybe aspires to, but it's not necessarily something that is actively happening. But anyway, so I was reading this article, and it read completely like a PR piece, like something written by Mirziyoyev's PR team. But there was this name of the woman which kind of didn't feel right, because the piece was written in this very biblical English, very, very strange. Like nobody writes like that in the English language, and definitely not someone who is a native speaker. So I decided to Google this woman. I found her. She had a website. She didn't seem to have any connections with Uzbekistan or Central Asia whatsoever. She didn't seem to have ever been to Central Asia. And I decided to message her. I asked her if this is her article. She replied to me saying, yes, that's her article. And I said, well, have you ever been to Uzbekistan? She confirmed that she hasn't. And, in this back and forth email exchange, I found out that she's never been to Uzbekistan. She doesn't know anything about Uzbekistan. In fact, she was approached by somebody, by a friend or an acquaintance of hers, who asked her to conduct an interview with somebody about Third Renaissance. She did it. This interview was very short. The man was basically praising Uzbekistan and the recent changes. And she sent this interview back to the person. Then her name was put as a byline to this absolutely ridiculous article. And she basically didn't have a problem with that. I mean, I'm not sure why exactly she decided to agree for that, but to me it just demonstrates how easy it is to get tricked by people who are ordering those articles, by state PR teams, and how dangerous it is actually. Because this woman, I specifically decided not to give her name because I don't want to embarrass her, but for a journalist, something like that is the end of his or her career. So yeah, I don't know what you think about that and whether you have such examples, but I just found it absolutely ridiculous and absolutely outrageous that things like that are happening, that people are actually being tricked into writing something that they know nothing about.
Yeah, no, that sounds very interesting. Do you remember the title of the article?
It had something to do with Third Renaissance. Wait.
Okay, Third Renaissance. I might have seen it. Yeah, that's quite sort of the things I come across normally as well. That's normal in a way. It has become one of the techniques of the these autocratic regimes, that they do target these international media. Their primary concern is the international audiences because of the stigma of the past and the sanctions of the past by the EU and the United States and the UK. So they do target these outlets, and I'm not surprised, but I have seen something similar on major outlets. I would say also Financial Times had a series of reports.
Yes.
Have you seen that? That was really funny to read each of them. And so that's the kind of basically the metas. Those are the kind of metas I'm talking about. They do target these outlets, and both academic and media and any just a think tank as well. Any outlet that would have impact on the perception of the international audience, especially policymakers and the state and the public.
What is actually also happening is that some individuals, or maybe even those PR companies working for governments, they sometimes publish paid articles in prestigious media outlets. And so I think it's really important that we as readers make sure that we check if some articles are not paid. But of course, nothing is foolproof. And there are also lots of articles and lots of publications which are not officially paid, but have been inspired by a PR agent sitting somewhere there, counting their money that has been paid by an autocratic government. So do you have any last message for our listeners on how to distinguish between genuine articles and real journalism and a paid article?
Yes. I mean, that is very important to me. That that is one of the reasons that why I started to sharing my research on social media and also on the the Substack. That we need to discern propaganda from facts, actual accurate account of the stories and account of the events that are happening in the region or anywhere in the world. This is just this applies to anywhere. Specifically thinking about Central Asia, since there are very few outlets that are accessible or critical enough that readers can inform themselves and educate themselves, it is challenging. This is where the attack on free media becomes so problematic by the governments or the defunding of the Radio Free Europe. So in terms of discerning propaganda from factual reports, well, this is very tricky because you need to look up the author first. Who's the author? What are their motivations? What could incentivize them to write such a positive article? Second, and check also the outlet itself. Who is it? Although it could be very much reputable and good established media, but that doesn't mean that they cannot publish propaganda. They are publishing, and we are seeing it, and they are getting paid. So that they are publishing, the authors get paid. I know a couple of examples of this, and I'm not blaming publishers because they might not be aware that this is actually a paid piece, and they might think that this is actually genuinely inspired by reforms and change in the region. So again, we need to read carefully and also expand our sources of information, where we receive and how we receive it. And then we need to compare. Okay, if you read Financial Times, what's called Economist or The Guardian or Fergana News for Central Asia or so Radio League, you need to read all of this and then do the analysis for yourself. Then, okay, how susceptible can I be to propaganda? Whether or not, can I distinguish between what is factual and what is narration and what is fictional, right? So again, read as many sources as possible.
It's a process. It's a full-time job, basically.
Yeah, it's a full-time job, which I'm not paid for.
This is what Dilmira Matyakubova and I have been doing for the past couple of years. So sign up for our Substack accounts, Dilmira Matyakubova Kleptocracy Series. And you can find it on Substack, just like my newsletter and my podcast. Thank you so much, Dilmira, and good luck to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for talking, Agnieszka, and good luck with your show.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.